Well, greetings. This is Dr. Dean Blevins, the Kansas City First Church discipleship pastor, and I'm inviting you along to a sort of series of studies called Discipleship Moments, where we are during the Lenten journey following Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem and exploring what it means as a part of that journey to participate both in the lives of the disciples that Jesus called, and in some ways to ask ourselves how we fit within this discipleship journey. Um, this time around, we're going to look at two disciples that normally you probably wouldn't put together, and that is Philip and Matthew. This may seem like an odd pairing, particularly after the other studies focused on the brothers. But I hope what I'm going to talk about will make sense why these two disciples have a lot to teach us, both in how they relate to each other, but also how they relate to us in our world. So we'll start with the disciple we probably know best, and that is Matthew. We do know that Matthew also went by the name Levi. He was the son of Alphaeus. Matthew was a tax collector, which was one of the most despised professions of that era. As a matter of fact, when Jesus called Matthew to follow him, one of the first things Matthew did after that was to host a meal and invite Jesus to it, where he invited all of his friends, his tax collectors and friends, which um, really kind of got the Pharisees a bit out of whack. They were perturbed that Jesus would be sitting with all these sinners, to which Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You know, I'm not called to be a physician to those who are, well, those who are well. I'm here to really be a physician to those who are sick. I'm not here to basically call the righteous. I'm here to call sinners." And Matthew, and by extension, Matthew's friends, the tax collectors, definitely fit that bill. And so Matthew was known for his early evangelistic zeal almost right away. What you might not know through church history, we've learned, is that Matthew also brought the gospel to Ethiopia and to Egypt. And so he was a powerful evangelist in that way. And also that he was martyred, and the king by the name of Hyrcanus had him killed with a spear. And that's information that we get actually through different sources within church history. The other disciple I wanted to talk about is Philip. Now, Philip, we don't know that much about. Most of what we know comes from the Gospel of John. We do know, like the brothers Peter and Andrew, Philip was a native of Bethsaida, and that he was sort of on his way to Galilee when Jesus stopped him and called him to be a disciple. We do know that as a result of that, in his invitation to follow Jesus, when Jesus said, "Follow me," Philip not only obeyed the call, but he later also brought Nathaniel along and introduced him as another disciple, and that occurred in John 1 around verse 43 when all of this happened. And so that Philip not only responded personally, but also invited Nathaniel into that conversation. And we'll visit with Nathaniel in a later session. Outside of that, we also know that Jesus actually turned to Philip during the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in John chapter 6. And it was Philip, he asked the question, what should we do about this crowd? It's also important to know that in John chapter 12, there was a group of Greeks who actually approached Philip in Jerusalem and asked if they could have an audience with Jesus. And this actually became a very important moment, even in Jesus' own understanding of his ministry. And it was a kind of turning point, if you will, in the Gospel of John when those Greeks were introduced to Jesus through Philip's intervention. So he was kind of an envoy, if you will. Probably the only other time we know about Philip is during what's called the upper room discourse, that conversation, and around John 14. Jesus is talking about the Father, and Philip finally says, if you just show us the Father, that'd be enough for us. And Jesus looks back at Philip and says, Philip, how can it be that you've been with me for so long, and you still don't know me? Because whoever sees me sees the Father. And I think that's an important kind of general rebuke. But ultimately, Philip also became a very powerful, as an apostle, became a very powerful evangelist. and did evangelistic work, and he was also martyred. We know that he was stoned and crucified in Heliopolis in Pergia, and that also comes through different church sources. So why put these two guys together? Well, maybe it's a matter of what's in a name. I've already alluded to the fact that Matthew was also known as Levi. Or the other way to say it is Levi was also known as Matthew. And the reason is that Matthew is the Greek for the Hebrew word Levi. And interesting enough, and also Levi is the Jewish term for the Greek name Matthew. So actually in Greek and Hebrew, they do talk to each other in the same way. But we know that he goes primarily by the name of Matthew. It's his Greek orientation, possibly because he was working in a Greco-Roman culture as a tax collector, which means he probably had some sort of Greek cultural background that was a part of who he was, and definitely reflected how he was understood in that society. Philip, by the way, is also a Greek name. We know he's probably Jew, but he was a Greek speaking and probably understood primarily as a Greek Jew during this period. And so both of these men actually reflect and represent, I guess, what you would call a different culture, if you will. Much like you would think actually coming from a different country, they embodied within themselves some really radical cultural differences between the Greco-Roman culture that Matthew was a part of, or the Greek culture that Philip emerged out of, probably even within his own family, and their Jewish roots at the same time. And it's those Greek relationships that probably, at least in the Gospels, provided the most key bridge point, if you will, in bringing people to Jesus. Matthew reached out to his fellow tax collectors. Probably many of them probably were within Greco-Roman culture. And reflected that community as Matthew ushered them into a table around Jesus. And as we've already said, it really was Philip who was the bridge builder, the intermediary, if you will, as Greeks wanted to come meet with Jesus. They went to someone that they could trust and know, and then it was up to Philip to introduce them into Jesus' life. I hope you hear that this kind of multicultural connection is really important for both of these disciples in the way in which they are able to both faithfully follow Jesus, yet not completely abandon those cultural connections and to use them as part of their own way of introducing people into Jesus's world and Jesus's life. You know, if you think about your own life, I wonder how many of us actually reflect and represent more than one culture. Now, I'm not saying that we are multicultural, that we might come from a different country or even a different ethnicity here in the United States per se, but that we live and work within different cultures. Much like Matthew, we may live in a kind of work culture, if you will, that, well, sometimes we might even wonder how it fits within Jesus' ideas. But we're in and around people who live and work within that given culture. Or it may be through our family or through our community connections. We actually are the natural point of contact between people in the world around ourselves, in our community, maybe even our family, who seem to come from such a radically different culture than Christian culture. And we are the people that they would most naturally come to be introduced to Jesus. Regardless of what that is, I hope you hear within these two stories the invitation for us to, yes, follow after Jesus, but also to become cultural bridge builders, not out of any sort of special preparation and going through any kind of particular cross-cultural training per se, though we might consider doing that at some point, but actually doing it out of the very cultures that we live in and inhabit that are a part of our everyday world. Two pretty amazing disciples who were not afraid to use their cultures in such a way as to make a difference in Jesus' life. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and it's given you some points of reflection. And we look forward to seeing you online. Blessings to you.